Kia ora, friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Holistic Human Podcast. My name's Amanda Bradley, and I shall be your host. Today, I'm talking to my favourite star law historian, Mary Stewart Adams, and she's back to talk about her new book, The Star Tales of Mother Goose. Now, this is more than your average book chat. We talk about the synchronistic happenings that led to her decision to write this book. There's some pretty esoteric stuff in there and it's super interesting, so definitely worth listening just for that. We talk about the possibility that Charlemagne's mother was the OG Mother Goose. We talk about the Swan Initiation of certain mystery schools. And as the conversation unfolds, it's quite apparent that this book will easily sit on your bookshelf next to Woman Who Run with Wolves or Joseph Campbell's book about the hero's journey, or Rudolf Steiner, probably next to Rudolf Steiner as well, but Rudolf Meyer's book called The Wisdom in Fairy Tales. But before we get into this interview, I just want to give a big shout out and a thank you to the two producers of this show. The first one being Jessica Bentsen, who's the creator of Toy Making Magic, which is like a Waldorfy craft tutorial subscription service. So you can subscribe, I think for it's like $8 a month, and then you have access to all of her toy making tutorials. So that's pretty cool. Thanks, Jessica. And the second sponsor is Tanglewood Toys, which is my absolute favorite online Waldorfy toy shop. They're based in New Zealand and they sell Waldorfy craft supplies and bespoke toys and natural products. And yeah, they're kind of like my go-to for special presents for Phoenix and for myself, really. I buy my watercolor paints from them. So go give them a follow. I'll chuck their social media in the show notes below. Yeah, they're both genuinely the people that run Tanglewood Toys, and Jessica are actually just really great humans. So if you go and follow them, you will not be disappointed. And if you want to support this podcast more, you can do so for free just by sharing it around on Facebook and social media, just to let people know that it exists and encourage people to follow me on there. Hit the subscribe button wherever you're listening or watching. And if you've got some spare coin that you want to flick my way that helps pay for the running costs and the general costs of raising a small human, you can go to buymeacoffee.com. Or is it, hang on a second, it's buymeacoffee/Amanda Bradley. And you can buy me a coffee, which is like you just pay $5 New Zealand and it goes towards stuff, or you can do more than that if you want to. You could also become a producer of the show like Jessica or Tanglewood Toys, or even be an executive producer where I do like a small interview with you in the next podcast and we can talk about your projects or just you in general. Which is always kind of fun. You could also buy an hour Zoom consultation with me because I'm starting to learn, well, I've got a lot of stuff in my brain when it comes to Waldorf education and parenting and Steiner handwork and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to have a chat with me about how to bring that into your classrooms or homeschooling program or whatever, I'm happy to do so over Zoom. Or even if you just have questions about anthroposophy or even tarot reading or something, be happy to have a chat with you over Zoom. But anyway, that's enough promotion-y stuff. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I love talking to Mary. She's so great, and it's nice to have this podcast so I have an excuse to talk to wonderful people like this. And I imagine you're going to have a great time listening to this. It's so much more than I thought it would be, and it's expanded my brain. So I hope it expands your brain too. Enjoy. Yeah. So welcome back, Mary. So glad that you can talk to me again.
Yes, it's my pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for staying interested.
Always. Yeah. I feel like, I think we're kind of back to back. I've had a podcast episode in between us, but that was a solo podcast. And the last one I recorded was with you about the year ahead.
Yeah.
Which was really cool. So for those of you,
interesting. It feels to me like a lot has shifted since then. I don't know if you're having that experience.
I feel like it has.
Yes. Yeah.
It feels like a lot's happened in the past 3 months, 2 months.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we get past that point of equinox and everything really shifts.
Mm,
And
totally.
I try to pay attention to that, because living with the cycle of the year is really important.
Yeah, it
Not
is.
just yes, there's the seasonal festivals, but also, can I find the mood in what's happening in my feeling life and in my day to day that's connected with that.
Mm.
This year it seems really more pronounced than other years.
The connection to your feeling life, you mean?
Yeah, yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's quite a different space looking at where we're at this year. And I keep, you know, how on Facebook and Instagram they come up with this time last year.
Yes,
And
yeah,
this time last year, New Zealand had gone into, we were in the middle of our level 4 full on lockdown. It's just
yes,
really
yeah.
interesting to be like, wow, it's very different here anyway, just in terms of
It
everything
is, and I think
normal.
even the attitudes toward what's happening, that has all shifted as well. We were at the beginning last year at this
Mm,
time, and now it's a year later, and everybody's just a bit, not entirely jaded, but also it's just a totally different mood.
very different.
Yeah.
It's like we're all kind of just evolving and moving on with what's happening. I was talking to a friend
Right.
last night, and it sounds a bit dramatic, but I guess the only thing I can compare it to is like when the world goes through big war times, you know,
Uh,
we're not going through a world war, although there's lots of that stuff happening at the moment, but that whole
yes.
collective consciousness of being like, everything's different. And then you kind of just settle into the change, so to speak.
Yes.
You kind of get used to it being in upheaval, and then at some point it's all going to level out again, we hope.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
ramble. For those of you who are tuning in, and who haven't heard me speak to Mary before, we've done two podcasts together where Mary has, the first one we did together, Mary explained what astrosophy is, which is really worth a listen. And the second one, like I said, we chatted at the beginning of this year about just generally what's happening in the skies and how it could possibly influence us here on the earth, and just those connections between what's happening in the cosmos, what's happening on the earth. So please feel free to go back and listen to those because they're really good chats. But today we're going to talk about Mary's new book.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And I'm so
My
excited.
favorite subject right now.
What's that?
I said my favorite subject right now.
Yeah, you've been so busy. Book signings,
Yes.
shipping
Yeah.
stuff off.
Yes. Yeah.
I also noticed a post you put up about not going on Amazon, which is quite a nice ethical decision to make.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, my sister, who did all of the illustration for the book, has a business called Cozy Cocoon, and she sells online internationally. And she's had quite a bit of experience with selling on Amazon and not selling on Amazon. So we were making a very conscientious decision and choice to not do that. And also, I think, in part, it feels to me that in order to sustain really rich cultural experience, we have to be supporting one another in local communities. That's not to say that we can't shop internationally, but just that in our local communities, we all need to be having, like, the bookseller needs to be selling the books so that the bookstore will be there. And if I just go sell my books anywhere, then what is that bookseller going to do? It's kind of like you have the shoemaker make the shoes. So it's better for the economy if we are supporting those who do that work. And I think there's just this kind of, at a certain point, there's this concept that you can have I don't know if you have Walmart in New Zealand. It's a big box store in the
We
United
have
States.
like Kmart and the Warehouse, which are our versions of it.
Yeah. So they sell everything from food to clothing to lawn furniture it's just like this blanket over everything.
Right.
And then those who might be artisans in these different areas, they can't compete at that scale. And their prices have to go up. And if everybody thinks that the best thing to do is pay the bottom dollar, then we're bottoming out our own economies. And the most important thing is really actually to pay the true price, What is the true price to pay for this coming into the world? And that would take into account the livelihood of the person who created it and those who are involved in it coming to market and making its way to the consumer. So these are really broad ideas, but it's just in part, it has informed our decision to just stay, to not take that route and trust that this subject matter and the desirability of knowing the stars this way is going to open doors and help it find its way to where it needs to go. Yeah,
that's really great. And I think that that you mentioning that thing about the bottom dollar being the priority for a lot of people. A lot of the time, most, there are lots of people that live in a situation that actually can't afford anything above the bottom dollar. So I'm not really talking to those that situation, because that's not what I'm talking about. But it's good that people, if we start producing things and selling in an ethical way, while still keeping in mind that the economy needs to keep going. It's not like we want it to be full on communism where, you know what I mean?
Right. And also that those of us who really don't have the means to do certain things, it is in part related to this kind of economy, because if those who can afford to pay the true price are paying less than those who can't pay true price have nothing with which to even pay the bottom.
Yeah, true.
Right. So it's got more of a kind of community conscience around it. If I support my local artist or my local farmer or my local bookseller, I'm helping something to happen. And this is a much larger conversation than I'm prepared to have, but it's
it's
why we're making this decision.
Yeah, no, sorry, that was like an impromptu question, but something
that's okay. It's good. It's really worthwhile right now for us to consider these things. We've just been pulled into a global experience through this pandemic, and it allows us to look at ourselves as a humanity, not just as an American or as someone from New Zealand or being Chinese, but as a humanity. How do we meet one another? And how do we celebrate our diversity by supporting what comes out of local geography?
Yeah, for sure. Hey, cool cup. Merchandise.
I actually stuck this sticker on here myself. I have to be really careful when I wash this.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool. So shall we jump into some questions that I have pre-prepared?
Yes.
Right. So I was going to ask you to do a mini biography for those people who haven't met you yet. Would you mind just saying a little bit of who you are?
I can go there. So I am a self-described star lore historian. And for me, that means that I am a person that tells the stories of the stars. And those stories can be informed by astrology, astronomy, or astrosophy, or anything that I can find in the cultural sphere that has stars tucked into it. So I'm always looking for the stars in everything. But I am in northern Michigan, northwest lower Michigan to be specific, because Michigan has an upper and a lower peninsula. And I live right on the shores of Lake Michigan, which is the 5th largest body of fresh water in the world. So it's a really beautiful environment. And about 10 years ago, a little bit more than that, maybe 12 years ago, I led an initiative to designate an international dark sky park on about 600 acres that's right here where I live. And when we did get that designation, we were only the 9th international dark sky park in the world. And for me, the motivation was, in addition to protecting the night sky, it was really about protecting the human imagination and our access to the stars. And it wasn't just, you have to get out there so that you can learn everything about the night sky. It's just, we need to be in the dark and to allow beautiful nightscapes to inspire us to dream and to just experience dark, and to know who are we when we're in the dark, when we don't have the answers, and can we get beyond fear and start to pay attention to how the imagination begins to live and move in that environment. And so out of that designation for the Dark Sky Park, a lot happened for me, and it includes that for about 10 years, I've been doing a weekly radio program called the Storytellers Night Sky, where I just do a 2-minute, here's what's happening in the sky for us in the Northern Hemisphere. It's not just localized to Michigan where I am, but it's about 40 degrees north. So it's for what I can see in the sky here. And it's really just the story, whether it's something that's coming from Greek mythology or poetry or contemporary culture, anything that I can connect the stars to so that we can have this really broad approach to understanding our relationship.
Cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And I guess more specifically than that, I'm the 7th of 8 children. And I think that lends itself to why I do what I do the way I do it, because I always had to fight to be heard in that crowd. Listen to me, I've got something to say.
Yeah. Funny how these things define us.
Yes.
Or guide us.
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, cool.
And I am also an anthroposophist, by which I mean that I study and am committed to the work of Rudolf Steiner in understanding the true nature of being human. Yeah.
Yeah. Nice.
That informs a lot of what I'm doing as well.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. It's good to be able to speak that too. Cool. Well, thank you for that. For a more in-depth picture into Mary, you can listen to the first podcast we did together, because Mary talks more about her upbringing and things, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So we are moving on to the book. Have you ever written books before? Like, would you call yourself a writer?
I would call myself a writer, but not because I've published a book before. I've written a lot. I've written a lot of radio script, but I've written a lot of newspaper and magazine articles. And actually, I got my degree in English literature, and I intended to be a journalist.
That's right.
My destiny took me in a different path, but writing has always been something that was important to me. And I have throughout my life always thought, I'm going to write that book. I'm going to write a book. And as these ideas were developing in me, it didn't occur to me that this would be the book, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting because you're doing the thing that you say you're going to do, and then you realize, oh, I was actually doing it, even though the whole time I was thinking, eventually I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
Because this particular project took about 15 years from conception to actually having this book in my hands.
Wow. Yeah.
And I think that writers, artists, singers, and anybody, we all go at a different pace. But I've lived deeply with these ideas, and I confess to being shy sometimes about broadcasting them too far and wide, because they're original ideas that need to be tested. And I don't want to diminish, in this case, nursery rhymes, or diminish the star knowledge by joining them to one another. And so I'm really sensitive to not being arbitrary there. See, does this really fit? And will this bring a greater sense of both the stars and the nursery rhymes? So I kind of took my time plotting through that.
These things take time when you've got two systems to bring them together. Because
there isn't really a path to follow. Right? Because we have the ancient mythologies and we have astrological practice, but to actually be living fully in contemporary culture and looking at the elements of contemporary culture and trying to dig into that to see, are there stars in there? Can I find that? It required of me knowing the stars, knowing a lot about the stars, knowing the star names, and having built associations and relationship, and then also having a pretty broad experience of literature. So, and at a certain moment, they kind of came crashing together. It was like, oh, these two things belong to each other.
Yeah.
And so it's not a class you take, right?
Yeah.
So I had to build it.
And like you said, you didn't want to diminish either. It's about bringing the two together and keeping them still authentic and not like you say, trying to squish them or.
Yeah, because there's some of these things are really deeply embedded in the culture.
Yeah.
And at a certain point there, I think there's an experience of people saying, don't disturb that. Don't
Mm,
shift that. And
mm,
I want to be mindful of that because I can be that way myself. You have a relationship to something and then somebody tells you that it belongs to something you had no idea it was related to. It's like, really?
yeah.
Yeah.
Can be
So
disorientating.
yeah. And so I've been really sensitive to that with this project, and not to just say, oh, well, I made it up, but also to not make a person feel confined. This isn't the only thing that the nursery rhymes mean. This is one
Mm,
of the things that they can mean.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's kind of building on to how did your journey to create this book start? Was there, you said it was 15 years ago in the making, was there like
Yeah.
a point where you were like, aha, this is my mission, or did it slowly
Yeah. There
grow?
were a couple things that entered into that, and it's really quite magical.
Mm,
And this is where it really matters that I'm the seventh of 8 children, because by the time I came along, my mom was, pretty taxed. She didn't have a lot of time.
yeah, yeah.
But she did make time to always read to me. So I was always read nursery rhymes and fairy tales as a child. And I was very proud of that throughout my childhood. And I always felt like I had this really deep grasp, like I knew all these tales. And
Mm,
then when I was in my 40s, I'm in my 50s now. So this is where the 15 years ago event happened. I was at my sister's house and my niece was singing a Mother Goose nursery rhyme that I had never heard.
mm,
She's singing this rhyme. It's I never saw a purple cow, I hope I never see one, but I can tell you anyhow, I'd rather see than be one.
mm.
That's really cute. Where did you get that? And when she said Mother Goose, I said, that's not Mother Goose. I know every Mother Goose rhyme.
Yeah.
And my sister pulled out her copy of Mother Goose, one that I had, growing up, and flipped it open and showed me the page. And I thought, how did I miss that rhyme?
Yeah.
Like, that's one that I really like. And I glom onto the things that I like. I hang on to them, because I
Mm.
want to use them. I want to sing them. And I went to bed angry that night.
Oh,
It was like a real thing. Like,
yeah.
wait, how did they get by me? And so when I woke up in the morning, I was getting a message out of a dream. And
Mm,
the message was, Mother Goose is Cygnus. So Cygnus is a constellation in the night sky known as the Swan. And I know that constellation, but I had never had this association. So getting this message, and it was one of those experiences where it wasn't like I was hearing this being spoken. It kind of comes as an idea that you're sensing.
mm,
But in
mm,
that idea was this sense that it's not only that Mother Goose is Cygnus, but that the rhythm and the whimsy in our language, when we do a rhyming like that, like I never saw a purple cow, I hope I never see one, that bouncing along, that this is a gift from the stars,
mm.
specifically from this region of the sky. And what happened in that moment, and of course, this was just a very short moment, it kind of all comes cascading
Yeah.
in, was that in ancient cultures, there was a belief that every human being comes from a star.
Mm,
And that as we incarnate, we gather, and we've talked about this before, but we gather the forces that form the physical body. So from Aries, the region of the head, and from Taurus, the larynx, Gemini, the limbs, all the way through to the feet, so in 12 parts. And
mhm,
then from the planets, which are the wandering stars, we have this rhythm, and that we get the rhythmic organs of the inner body. So
mm.
Venus is connected to kidneys, and Jupiter to liver, and Saturn to spleen. So I knew this coming out of ancient cultures and well into the Middle Ages and beyond,
Mm.
that this was something that was understood, but it had never occurred to me that the rhythm of our speaking was also something.
Hmm.
And I think, I don't want this to sound too esoteric, but when I was a teenager, I took French when I was in high school, and then I had an opportunity to go to France after I graduated. And I was a very good student in French, except that I was very shy about speaking French. And then when I went to France, the words just came out so easily. And I realized it was the rhythm of life in France and that the words belong to that culture.
Yeah.
And so we can learn languages in no matter where we are in the world, but when we're in the rhythm of how life occurs in a particular geography, like that rhythm of speaking belongs to that geography.
Yeah.
Right? So these are things in the deep background of this moment when I got this message, Mother Goose's Cygnus.
Mm.
And out of that came this sense that, oh, our speaking and is that the human being is more fully related to the constellations than I realized. I thought it was just the constellations of the zodiac, but there's all these other constellations that also are imparting a gift. And so I'm making this gesture with my hands because I realized I had this like kind of flat plane. Here's the zodiac, and it just went like it fully opened up. I had this amazing, awesome moment, and I kind of giggled at myself because I had been angry when I went to bed. So I thought, well, it's not all bad sometimes to get angry, so long as it's not focused at anybody. I was just angry with myself.
Yeah.
And so I lived with that for a while. And then the first nursery rhyme of Mother Goose that became obvious to me how it was connected was Hey Diddle Diddle. Are you familiar with that one?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, diddle, the cat and the fiddle, the cow jumped over the moon. Little dog laughed to see such a sport, and the dish ran away with the spoon. So I think this is yes, this would be true for the whole world. In the month of May, we are positioned on the earth such that we're looking perpendicular to the plane of our galaxy. So not the plane of our planetary system, but the plane of the galaxy. And what happens is the Milky Way will be flat around the horizon, kind of like a dish. It runs away from view. We don't see it. And in the northern hemisphere at that time of year, the Big Dipper, which is a constellation that always stays up in the northern sky, straight overhead, looks like a spoon. And also in May, the moon will be new among the stars of Taurus, which is the cow. So the cow jumps over the moon. So each character in that rhyme can be connected to a constellation or a celestial phenomena. And so I just lived with that for a while. And then one of my daughters said to me, well, aren't there other rhymes, Mom? So I pulled out Mother Goose and went looking for the stars to see where they were tucked in. And so that's really where the idea started. And then I called my sister one day and I said, Pat, you have to paint the Louvre.
Paint the Louvre.
The Louvre because, okay, so let me back up a little bit. So what happens is then I started researching, like, all right, where do they come from? Who's Mother Goose? Like, where does this come from? And I really needed to learn the history of the thing if I wanted to talk about it, because during the years that I was working the initiative for the International Dark Sky Park and all this time doing radio stuff, I want to have the information be well rooted, right? So I'm always researching. And so the first written reference to the title Mother Goose comes in France in the 17th century during the reign of Louis XIV. And it's in this little gossip column that's written by one of the members of Louis XIV's court. It's called La Muse Historique. And there's a reference to something that has happened or some bit of gossip being like a Mother Goose tale. And so it's clear from the context that Mother Goose as a title is commonly understood among the people that would be reading this, right? Which I would imagine is all of Paris of the day. So Jean Leray is older, but is also contemporary to a man by the name of Charles Perrault. So Charles Perrault he worked in service to the king. And when he retired, he published a book called Tales from the Past with Morals, The Tales of Mother Goose. So these were fairy tales, Cinderella, Little Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty. And he was writing down the tales that were being shared in the salons around Paris at that time. So also this isn't the origin of the term Mother Goose, but it's kind of like, okay, here's where it's being written down and it's getting more formed at this time. But Charles Perrault had a brother, Claude, who was an architect. And Claude designed the east-facing wing of the Louvre, which at the time was the palace of the king.
Was it?
Yes. It was a palace. And then he also designed the Paris Observatory, So I was having this really fun experience of, here's these two brothers, Claude and Charles. One is writing down the Mother Goose fairy tales, and the other one like is designing the observatory. Like, so they're brothers, and it's the stars and the stories, like they're right there. Right. So I called my sister. I'm like, you have to paint the Louvre. You had to paint the Paris Observatory. Like, I need these pictures because I'm going to be doing some presentations. And eventually that led to me writing a little fairy tale that started. There were once upon a time, there were two brothers who worked in the service of a mighty king. And so mighty was this king, he was known throughout the land as the Sun King. All right, so this is the setup to talk about Louis XIV. But what's remarkable is that during the time of Louis XIV, there was this unusual event called the Maunder Minimum. And Maunder was the name of the scientist that discovered this. So Louis XIV reigned for a long time, and for all but 2 years of his reign, this phenomena happened where there were very few spots on the sun. So our sun always exhibits, not always, but it exhibits sunspots, and they seem to peak and wane in 11-year cycles. And there will be thousands of sunspots over the years. But during the entire time that Louis XIV was the king, there were very few sunspots. And when this was first being discovered, I think about 200 years later, the idea was that this might have caused the mini ice age that occurred at that time, because there was a great cold that swept over Northern Europe and a great famine, and thousands of people died. All right, so this is all going on at that time. So I'm like building this story about the Sun King and this great cold and the sun going quiet, and these fairy tales come up, like Mother Goose is there to kind of save the day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's been that was an important part of the journey. And I'll just tell you one other magical thing that happened is that I was in New York with my sister, and she was painting Mother Goose. So I'm holding up the book so that you can see, Amanda. And she's on the constellation Cygnus, the swan. And there's a star right here at the beak that has the name Alberio. That's the beak of the swan. And my sister had this painting on her drawing board, and I was kind of showing off, and I said, oh, do you know the name of the star that's right there at the beak? Because I knew that she didn't. And so I was going to, I'm the younger sister, kind of being a hot shot. And she said no. And the moment she said no, the star name just kind of disappeared from my mind. Like, I totally forgot it. It's like, oh, oops, I was about to show off, and now I don't remember what I was going to say. So I went to this book that I have called Star Names, Their Lore and Meaning. I open it up to Cygnus, and I see that this beak star is called Alberio, and I had underlined there that there was a star near Alberio that went nova. So not supernova, that's beyond our galaxy, but there's a star that went nova in like 1697. And I was like, wait a minute, that's the same time that Charles Perrault is writing his Mother Goose fairy tales down. Like, so the star in the swan, which I've been told in a dream is Mother Goose, like exploded as he's writing this down for the first time. So I had this like amazing moment of like, wow, we didn't make this up. Like the stars, like something really happened historically. And then my sister said, what's that noise? So we were hearing something very unusual outside. So we walked out of her house, and there was what's called a murmuration. Do you know that word?
No.
When all of the birds gather together in one place. So all of the blackbirds on Long Island in New York gathered like right around her house, and were squawking and squawking and squawking. And we were just like, what's happening? It was like we had stepped into this time stream, an unbroken time stream. And the blackbirds figure in the very first rhyme that's in the book, Sing a Song of Sixpence. And so Pat was so funny. She went running down the street to see if there were birds at the end of the street. She's down there. There's no birds down here. There's no birds. Like all the birds were just in the trees around her house.
Oh.
So we're having this like super moment. And then eventually we went into Manhattan to meet my daughter for brunch. And she said, oh, I'm going to take you to see an exhibit of The Little Prince, all of the drawings by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. And they were at the Morgan Library. And so we were telling her very excitedly about how we, had discovered this star that went supernova in the Swan, and it's related to Mother Goose. And then all the blackbirds came, and we were very animated about it.
Yeah.
And we get to the Morgan Library, and while I was waiting for everybody else to get their tickets, I walked into the reception area. And I don't know if it was like this, but in my mind's eye now, all I remember is one display case. And I walked over to look at it, and it was Charles Perrault's original Mother Goose manuscript.
No.
Yes. And I was like,
Oh my God.
like it just kept going. And I really took that as just this strong, like a pronouncement, like you've found something, keep going, keep going.
Yeah.
And so it all the way from the stars to the birds to the painting back in history. I mean, these pieces kept falling into place. So it's been really magical that way.
Wow.
So in answer to your question, 10 minutes ago, was there an aha moment? There was, but the first moment was Mother Goose's Cygnus, and it was kind of a riddle. I've read in Rudolf Steiner that the spiritual world speaks in riddles, right? So then what I love about that is that then it's like an invitation to go on a great adventure to find the answer. Like it's like being given a treasure map and having to decode it.
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
Those are some amazing synchronicities. Or I don't know if you've ever heard of a blogger called Christopher Knowles, who his stuff verges on like kind of extreme conspiracy, but he's got this whole concept of synchromysticism, which is pretty much what you're talking about, but he kind of takes it to a place that's a little bit dark. But the point of it is this whole like the synchromysticism in life is pretty much what you talked about, which is really
and I think that what happens for me is that because I do spend a lot of time researching, but then also looking for the stars, not just gazing at the stars, but seeking the stars in everything. I'm always listening for that, and things show themselves when you kind of tuned your focus into that, and it does get really magical.
It certainly does. And it's interesting you talked about how you were looking at the zodiac and then suddenly you realized, there's this whole other skyscape. And it's interesting because I've been working with just some correlations between the days of the week and the planets and trees. And I've been trying to work out what that would be in New Zealand, because it's a different hemisphere and we've got different people and different culture. And I was trying to find the Māori relationship they have with the planets. But it's very different because they are, they're sea navigators. So their relationship to the stars is very much that of being on the ocean, and their important star points are all different constellations rather than the zodiac and the planets.
Right.
So they've got, just like you said, that Cygnus that's a whole thing. For Māori, there are all these like Matariki, which is the Pleiades, and there's all these other constellations which they have all got stories related to the gods and things rather than the planets. And it's just this whole mind shift of being like, actually, there is value to the zodiac and the planets and stuff, but as soon as you open your consciousness to the fact that all these other constellations have an impact on us, that's just cool.
It really, the experience I had was that it pulled me into wholeness, and I didn't realize that I had this kind of flat plane of consciousness. And I think for me, what I experience, at least in Western culture in the Northern Hemisphere, and in part informed by studying anthroposophy, is this idea that former cultures were very much awake to their relationship to the natural world and to starry worlds. So the stars and the planets, and living in a relationship with something that was living. So it's not just a gaseous body out there, but this is actually the habitation or the outer vestment of a divine being that has something to impart, some gift or some challenge even to the human being. And you see this in every culture around the world. Every culture has a star lore. And that what happens as we move through civilization, we get more and more what we would call civilized, this way of knowing our relationship to the environment changes and it goes to sleep. And this is of necessity because we have to become self-directing. We
Mm.
can't always be trying to read something outside of ourselves in order to determine what am I going to do. I have
Mm.
to come from selfhood and self-knowledge. And so this kind of way of knowing that the stars and the planets are related to divine spiritual beings, that goes to sleep. And then, at least in that context, what Rudolf Steiner says is that we are now living in a time where it's we as a humanity that are speaking to the stars. So the stars spoke once, then it's world destiny that they've gone silent. And now we, out of the pain of that silence, can begin to recognize what are we speaking. And I think for me, what I've seen is that in this period of time, that the stars really start to go silent, which begins with the scientific revolution. So Nicholas Copernicus introduces the idea that the Earth is not fixed at the center, but that it's in motion around the sun, and it just becomes another planet, and it kind
Mm.
of diminishes. And then Isaac Newton really takes what had been these descriptions of the motion of the heavens, which was really diverse, and puts it into a description that gives one single law, one universal law that describes all motion. So it gets really simplified in a certain way, that this is when the star knowledge begins to go silent. And at that time, simultaneously, what's showing up? Fairy tales, nursery rhymes, this stuff
Mm.
that starts to show up in the culture that keeps this lightness and whimsy and ability to know something greater, or even something mischievous that's operating according to laws that don't belong to this world, that shows up kind of as a placeholder, as a really beautiful placeholder that always ends with a happily ever after. So it's
Mm.
like humanity, you're going to go through this period of time where you're going to forget your origins. You're going to forget this greater harmony, and that's okay. You have to go through it because you're going to have to know yourselves. But the risk is you might get to the other side and totally forget that you're connected. So in order to make sure that you don't, we're just going to drop in these nursery rhymes and fairy tales and things like this that will keep you, you get to say, oh, isn't that cute? It's a fairy tale, but there's a deep moral wisdom operating there. And the stars are hidden in there.
That's such a great way to explain that.
Yeah.
I love it. That's so good. People often ask about the fairy tales in class one, like why do them? And that's such a great reasoning for it. I mean, you
Yeah.
kind of
And
know
also,
that, but putting it how you put it is
well,
hard.
right, to give it that kind of historical context, like when
Mm.
are they really written down? When do they really start
Yeah.
to show up? And fairy tales are not about, it's not a journalistic account of something that happened historically. It's about moving through a spiritual encounter and the union, the sacred marriage that takes place, or the rescuing that has to happen. Oftentimes it's the hero has to rescue the maiden. It's not male and female. It's the one reading is always the hero,
Mm.
and the female is the soul that we're trying to unite with. So to increase that consciousness, and it's always through virtue that awakening comes. So for me, it's reinforcing that idea that out of good deeds, good things come.
Mm.
And when we're faced with dire challenge or dire circumstances, there will be a happily ever after.
Mm.
And what Rudolf Steiner describes in talking about fairy tales is that they work in us the same way food works in the body. So when we eat, long after we've eaten, the food is imparting its forces to us so that we have strength and energy and health and well-being ideally. And that a fairy tale works the same way. Long after we've read it, it's nourishing the soul. And when I think about that in contemporary culture and about how wonderful it is to nourish the soul with happily ever after in the face of all of the things that are happening in the world,
Mm.
I feel like, well, why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I feed myself well? Because in order to face what we're confronted with in the day-to-day, we have to have a really balanced health and well-being, not only physically, but in our soul, spirit, nature as well. And that's what fairy tales and nursery rhymes do.
Mm. Mm. Well, that kind of leads me to the next question of like, what defines a nursery rhyme? Are they just, could any poem be a nursery rhyme?
I guess it could. I mean, what I mean when I say nursery rhymes, so the Mother Goose nursery rhymes that are in this book, The Star Tales of Mother Goose is officially the title of the book, were written down mainly by Thomas Carnan in the 1700s. And what he did was he took the little ditties that were being sung by the children in England of that time, and he kind of connected them with some Shakespeare, and he used the term Mother Goose and said, these are Mother Goose's rhymes for the nursery. Right. So it's just any little sing-song thing, and it could be anything, yes, any little ditty. I think that at least I've had the experience that when we're around small children, it's very easy to fall into sing-song and to bounce along. Yeah. And they live much closer to the spiritual world from whence they've recently come. And so that way of communicating belongs to that world. It bounces, it sings, it plays. And so so nursery rhymes are that. They're like little ditties, little bouncing things.
Where do you think the name, why is it called Mother? I mean, you said it came from a spiritual perspective, came from the Cygnus constellation, but why do you think it was called Mother Goose? Is there any reason for that?
What I have found is that it might be related to a historical person by the name of Bertrada of Leon. Huh? So she lived in the 8th or 9th century in France. She's most well known because she was the mother of Charlemagne, Charles the Great. And so she had what would be described as a club foot. And she was referred to as the Goose-Footed Queen. Oh. And what was believed at the time, at least as far as I can tell, is that somebody who had that kind of a formation was not just looked at as, being less than or handicapped, but that she actually had a foot in the other world, in the spiritual world, and could tell the stories of that world. And she raised Charlemagne that way, kind of like a good homeschooling mom, bringing this kind of wisdom from the other world. So she was known as the Goose-Footed Queen. And it's possible that she was the first Mother Goose. But also she was the daughter of Charibert de Leon, who's a very interesting figure in history that is connected to, there was a really popular legend at the time called Floris and Blanchefleur. And this was written in a way that tried to show the relationship and the challenge between Christianity and what was called paganism, but how love conquers all, and how the Christian prince marries his pagan beloved, and they're able to overcome what might otherwise be something that stands in the way of cultures being able to unite or appreciate and respect one another. And so this legend and this tale was very, very popular. And it seems to have been about Bertrada's father, Charibert de Leon, who's this really significant figure in history. And then it's 900 years before the term Mother Goose gets written down. But during that time, there was something known as the Swan Initiation, which was the third stage of initiation, when the would-be initiate arrived at a way of understanding all of the things of the world according to their own way of being. Like all things speak their names to them. And when you had reached this third degree of initiation, you surrendered your name and took on a title. And so you could say Mother Goose is the title of a swan initiate. So one who tells the tales of this other world in a way that can impart health, truth, goodness, beauty to the human being without having to say, oh, I wrote that. It's not taking any credit. It's just speaking to a higher universal truth. And when I first came upon this information, I thought about, like in the United States, we have Mark Twain, which is the pen name for Samuel Clemens. And I wondered if maybe a pen name isn't like in this line of this practice of giving a title to something that's imparting a high moral wisdom. Mark Twain actually refers, it's something that's called out by a boatman when you're on the riverboat ferries going down the Mississippi, and that you would drop a rope. It had knots tied in it, and you would drop a rope to see how deep the water is. And when you say, when the boatman would call Mark Twain, then you would know you were at the second knot on that rope.
Oh.
And then you know how deep the water is, so the ferryman could navigate around shallow or deeper waters. And so this name that he takes to write under is not a name so much as it is like a title or something.
Oh, Mark.
Yeah.
Mark Twain.
Mark, yeah, Mark.
Interesting. So it's almost like when people do that, they're kind of removing their ego a little bit from the
and removing the
process.
personal. Right. And I think what happens is it allows it to be more universally accessible.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Yeah. Huh. Yeah. So Mother Goose, I'm suggesting that Mother Goose is actually the title of a Swan Initiate.
What mystery school is that?
Well, I mean, this will be coming out of, it's in France.
It's not like it's specifically Rosicrucianism or Mason.
Yeah, it is, because Cherubim Leon seems to be directly connected to Rosicrucianism.
Right.
And to the being, and to Christian Rosenkreuz.
Interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So then there's his daughter, Bertrada, the queen with the goose foot, who's the mother of Charlemagne. And Charlemagne is the one who really establishes schools, and he does so much. And this is being inspired by this wisdom that's being imparted to him by his mother, who's receiving this gift from her father, about whom this legend has been written about how to overcome the challenge between diverse cultures. So you can see this really high inspiration working all the way down in right into fairy tale, right into nursery rhyme. Almost as though, okay, I'm saying this, but it's almost as though something is coming that will include the human being no longer remembering the origins, like where does a human being come from? And during this kind of desolate time of being cut off from a knowledge of oneself in relationship to the spiritual world, that there's this kind of happy little thing stuck in there, a nursery rhyme, a fairy tale, something that will just keep it going and hold us until we can remember again.
It's kind of like going through that point in the lemniscape where you're expansive, and then you go through this little point, and then you kind of build on it again. It's like the little nursery rhyme and the fairy tales are something little we can hold on to, and then we can expand it back out again once we've processed it.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to know that we do have to go through this period of not knowing from some external source, right? Like we can't just have this unbroken sense that, yes, I come from the spiritual world. And I don't mean that just in the course of one life, but as a humanity. There does come a point when, in order to demonstrate what a human being is, we have to act out of our own self-knowledge. And it can't be, I'm doing this because the stars are dictating it, or the church leader is dictating it, or family tradition is dictating it. I do have to come from my individuality, out of the wholeness of being human, recognizing that I have relationships not only to the other human beings in the world, but to the environment in which I find myself, and that includes the stars.
Yeah.
And how do I relate? How do I know what that is? So this is just, to me, it's like a first step in saying, yes, this nursery rhymes are one of the rungs on the ladder to get there.
Yeah, for sure. This conversation is so great. You've kind of already shared one of the nursery rhymes I was going to ask you to share one of the favorite nursery rhymes, and it's links to the stars. You did the Hey Diddle Diddle one. Did you
I
have
did.
another one?
Yes, my favorite nursery rhyme was always Goosey Goosey Gander. So it's a goosey goosey gander, whither dost thou wander? Upstairs and downstairs in my lady's chamber. There I met an old man who wouldn't say his prayers. I took him by the left leg and threw him down the stairs. Okay, I don't know why that was my favorite one, but I just always thought it was really funny.
Yeah.
And it seems to have been related to the reign of Henry VIII in England. So he's the king that separates from the Catholic Church and from the Pope and establishes the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, then the Pope excommunicated all of England. So people who might not have agreed with the king were not allowed to celebrate their sacred rites. And so it was really contentious.
Mm.
But what happened at that time is that anybody who did secretly practice would get in big trouble. So there was something called priest holes, where the priests would hide out to do their service. And if they were caught, then they'd be forcibly dragged out into the street. So kind of like being kicked down the stairs, right?
Yeah, right.
But so I look at it as, if I'm trying to find the stars in it, that Goosey Goosey Gander is the constellation Cygnus. And the lady's chamber is the Milky Way, because Cygnus is a constellation that flies along the Milky Way. And then the old man is Cepheus, which is the constellation of the king that's right next to Cygnus. And then the stair set is the constellation Cassiopeia, which looks like a big W.
Mm-hmm.
And it also looks like kind of a crooked stairs, like a child might draw.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that Cygnus is the Goosey Goosey Gander, that the Milky Way is the chamber, the old man is Cepheus, and the stairs are Cassiopeia.
Mm.
So when you see it in the sky, you can imagine just that little ditty, like it's moving across the sky. So I don't know, do you see Cassiopeia?
I don't think we do.
Yeah.
Not
So
sure.
it rises up in the northern hemisphere Cassiopeia is always overhead in the northern hemisphere, but Cygnus is not. So Cygnus rises up just now, it's starting to, and then it sets December, January.
So that would mean that we do see it down here if it sets, because it would come
you
down.
would see Cygnus.
Yeah.
Cassiopeia never sets.
No, I only know about that constellation because of a Joanna Newsom song, which is, I don't know if you know her.
No, I don't. But I do know that if you were to draw a line from from Cassiopeia straight through the earth, it would come out in New Zealand.
That's cool.
So there's something overhead there that it points to, but I'm not remembering now.
That's funny. I wonder if there's a meeting, a constellation that it points to down here. Be interesting to know what it's pointing at.
Right. I used to know, but I don't now.
That's right.
Yeah. So, all of the rhymes that are in this book do refer to constellations that are visible in the northern hemisphere. And that's not to say that there aren't rhymes connected to the constellations of the southern hemisphere. But when these rhymes historically first started to show up was just at the beginning of the age of exploration, when, at least for the Europeans, they started to go south and go below the equator and discover new things, and then make up their own ideas about the groups of stars that they were seeing there. Right.
And we just have to look at indigenous myth will be around these. It's interesting that, and there'll be different kinds of song or their own version of rhyme about it, I'm sure.
Like a different rhythm, different, because the language is different and it brings its own quality. I had this experience once of, because I read charts as well, and a friend had asked me to read her chart. Well, somebody that I only know through this work, and she lives in China. And I had the hardest time. And I had to eventually explain to her what was happening for me, because when I think about Chinese culture, how different it is, even though she's in the northern hemisphere, as am I, but I'm in the west and she's in the east. And even though we do see the same stars, I'll just say it this way, the stars are calling forth something different from the geography there than they do from here. And my trying to understand the relationship of the human being to the stars from that part of the world was really challenging because I had never been there.
Mm.
We really experienced the quality of the stars. You know, the Chinese have a deep, deep culture in relationship to the stars. And it was an interesting encounter for me to have within myself, you know, that I don't want to just superimpose
Mm.
my Western ideas out of astrology or experiencing the stars here and just say, okay, yeah, I can interpret a chart for you. You're
Mm.
living in a different part of the world. It was just, it required of me to get really, really broad,
Mm-hmm.
interesting experience. And it's the same thing for me with the Southern Hemisphere,
Mm.
because there's such a rich culture there in relationship to the stars. And that's, I'm sure that there's plenty of song and mythology and tale and things that live in contemporary culture that are streaming from that understanding that comes out of the ancient time.
Mm. Mm. Definitely.
Yeah.
It's important to keep reconsidering that, especially when we go through processes of decolonization and just
Yeah.
realizing that we have to go right into even like in being in New Zealand and being Maori and being like, oh, I'm so steeped in these Western traditions that feel so at home, but also there's a part of me that's like, oh, I also have to kind of like work on decolonizing a little part of myself and reconnecting with what's actually true
Yes.
for here, you know.
Yes.
And you've got those different streams of hereditary that you're working with, but yeah, it's just interesting.
And I think that the stars really help us in that work.
Yeah.
And you're using the word decolonizing. I would even say deconstructing, because they're holding something. We are shifting and changing, but the stars are holding their place.
Yeah.
Right. And so
Yeah.
to really try to penetrate the kind of eternal nature of that, like a fixed star that hasn't shifted in a certain respect relative to our lives in the course of one life between birth and death, you know, for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. Like I think about how in the 1960s the Aswan Dam was built in Egypt in order to manipulate the Nile. And I mean, the Nile has been flowing and flooding since the beginning of time. And 50 years ago, human beings said, now we're going to stop that. Like, what consequence there? And this festival celebration of the rising of the star Sirius and how it was connected to the flooding of the Nile. Very festive, welcoming, grateful experience of the stars, because then the people living there would know it was time to move off the floodplain, because the river would overflow, but it was triggered by a star. It's almost like the star water is now nourishing the earth. And then once the waters recede, you come back and plant there, you have very fertile soil. You know, this stopped. The relationship of to the star in that process stopped in 1967. After thousands and thousands and thousands of years. It's staggering.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, moving on to another question, if you're all good with that. I think you've kind of answered it, and I think people listening to this would probably agree with me because I asked you whether this kind of book would be suitable to be next to something like Women Who Run with Wolves, or that Joseph Campbell book, A Hero's Journey, or the Rudolf Meyer book, The Wisdom of Fairy Tales. I reckon it would go quite nicely next to those.
Well, I feel like it's an honor to hear you say that. And it's in that vein. It definitely is. And so part of the challenge is that the art is very whimsical. And the first part of the book is nursery rhymes. So it's easy to say, oh, this is a children's book. But then when you get to the second part of the book, you realize that it's not intending to separate from children, but just that it's to inform adults about, all right, here's the history, here's where this comes from, and then here's how you can find the stars in this. And my feeling is that as adults, we kind of need this more than children do, because the children are still awake to that, and we can cultivate that and not just shut it down too soon. And so I never want to say, oh, you need to take a child out and show them the stars that are in that nursery rhyme. That's not the right thing to do.
Mm.
It's really important to help a healthy imagination develop. And I feel that as an adult, knowing that the nursery rhymes are like seeds that later can be called on when the time for developing intellect is right.
Mm.
So it's got this kind of funny little you have to have the Mother Goose nursery rhymes in the first part in order to understand the second part. So it's like you have to do this, like we have to have this childhood experience before we can really understand a lot of what it is to be a human being.
Mm.
And to not just dismiss those experiences as though they belonged to some childish fantasy. And like these are real experiences. When we say, oh, it was just a fairy tale, it's like, oh, as a matter of fact, that might have been more true than anything else that we've ever experienced.
Yeah,
There's a quote from Goethe that I put at the very back of the book. I'll read it to you because it says it much more poetically than I just did. For what in poetry and fiction charms, and yet to our mind incredible appears, will with greater pleasure still be heard, because it really happened.
Mm.
So it is about connecting to that part of ourselves that we might. I have an experience that too many of us as adults do not recognize the value of a healthy imagination. And that imagination is often equated with one, make-believe, and two, with childhood. And imagination in terms of spiritual science is actually the first step in spiritual cognition. And imagination is the kind of thinking that we need in order to approach something that lives beyond the sense world.
Mm.
So a child doesn't have a problem with that.
Mm.
I mean, you know, we hear about children with imaginary friends, and they can make believe, and they can do a lot of things that it is more challenging for an adult to do. But this in spiritual science is referred to as imaginative cognition. And once we have begun to really develop that sense for how to know something greater than what the senses can reveal to us, the next step is inspiration. And inspirative consciousness then has to do with really being able to now orient in that world that is beyond the sense perceptible world. And then the third step would be intuition, and really being able to find our way into the beings that populate that world. So it's moving beyond the physical sense perceptible. And the quest is to do that in a healthy way. So we want to build healthy imaginations and not just random make-believe that isn't rooted in something that has a greater, what's the word I want to use? That's connected in a very deep way.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm. And this book helps people understand how that
I'm certainly wanting it to. That's really my point, is to say, you know, we just need, and it's okay when we think about things that are greater than, that they be things that are happy and bouncing and whimsical. You know, it's not always just seriousness and drudgery. Yes, there's a responsibility that comes with knowing these things, but it can be joyful.
Yeah. For sure. That's nice. Well, you also answered who this book's been written for and what its format is. For everybody, for everybody. And it was probably be a good book to have, even if you've got the Mother Goose fairy tales, because one, there's all that lovely artwork done by your sister. Did you say?
My sister Patricia, yes.
Yeah, and then also you've got instruction. Do you mean you've got instructions to help people find the stars in the sky?
Yes, to find the stars in the sky. So the lion and the unicorn, they're fighting for the crown. So this is Leo and Monoceros and Corona Borealis.
Ah, cool.
And
so
lots
of that information can be quite hard to find, and if you're new to looking at the stars, it can be quite like, oh, they're all just.
So then there's maps. And here's the picture of the sky. Here's when they're the most prominent, and here's how you find them.
Yeah, that's cool.
How you orient. So there really is, it's not just knowing the stars is not easy. Somebody can't just hand it to you. You have to do it yourself. So it really does support this kind of individuality that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how do I become aware out of myself? And the stars, they wait for that from us. So it's intended to really be a guide to help find your way around the night sky, and then ideally be like a starting off point so that you can find other things and other pieces out of whichever culture you might look into. It's just a fascinating journey. It's endless. Because as I said, every culture has a star lore, and there's so much that we can learn.
Yeah
That's
so cool. Do you have any general advice for people who would want to give book writing a go? Because self-publishing seems to be a thing that is a lot more possible than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that for me, what was most important was to have somebody that would be compassionately critical as an editor.
Yeah.
And to really be able to say, yes, this is legitimately interesting, right? Like this isn't your own idea that you're in love with, but this actually can stand up, and I think people would be interested in this. Because I think when you go through a process of submitting to a big publishing house, that process is built in there, and you're either accepted or rejected based on the criteria that they've established for determining that, because they know their audience and they know when they're willing to invest money to promote something. But when we're self-publishing, we don't have that same critical assessment necessarily. So that was really important for me. And then also to find to work with people who have a good artistic sense, because even I think if it's not a picture book like this one is, there's something to having a very nice quality and beauty of appearance. Again, Goethe, beauty is everywhere a welcome guest. So choosing the technical things like the font for the type and the layout of the page and the book design, all of these things, so that the reader feels very much held by what you've created. Those are the things that I would think about. And then I had to set a deadline, because as I said, this project was many, many, many years. And there were many times where I just thought, well, this isn't really a book. This is just research I'm doing. And I talk about it a lot in different programs that I do and on the radio. And, yes, my sister's been painting these pictures, but we haven't laid things out yet. I had to pretty much come to a point where saying, here's your deadline. Nobody's imposing it on you. You have to set it for yourself and stick to it, so that you actually get to that point and say, yes, I'm doing this, or no, this is not going to happen.
Good point. So, otherwise it could be something that you just have for your whole life hanging over your
whole life. And I think that's part of the challenge with self-publishing, because you can go at your own pace. And then also trusting that, I'll say it this way, what happened to me was really recognizing that, oh, this was the right time for this to come in the world. And I did beat myself up a lot through the years thinking, am I ever going to do that? And now I realize that, oh, it was taking its time. Because I think that when we write, kind of like the ancient Greeks used to say, sing to me, O muse, we are having ideas and we're being creative, and something is engaging with us in that process. And that something has a greater sense of timing than we do.
True.
I really believe that. And we can push against it, but it pushes back. And it usually wins.
Yeah, it does.
It challenges us to see, are you going to doubt yourself now? Are you going to judge yourself now? Are you going to think that you're lazy? Or are you going to recognize it's not time yet?
Good point.
Yeah.
Nice. That's very valuable advice.
Yeah.
If you haven't any more to say on that subject, I shall ask my next question.
Yeah.
So it's a well, two questions in one. Have you got other projects in the pipeline, like other books and stuff you want to chat to people about and let them know where they can find it all? And where can we buy your book?
Okay, two good questions.
Yeah.
So yes to the first. There's a lot of swag that we're like, oh, we could make a poster out of this. We got, like I've got this cool sticker and sweatshirt. I mean, my sister is a designer, right? She can't stop.
Cool.
Right?
Are you going to make hoodies?
Yeah, that's what this is.
Cool.
I mean, she made this. Okay, I'm like all tucked in here, but she made this for the whole shirt, right? Like it's got this crossover.
I thought it was like a turtleneck. That's cool.
It is, but it's a hood, actually, the way she did it. And then it says starlore.co.
Amazing.
Which is the website where you can buy the book.
Cool.
So starlore.co. No M at the end.
Yeah.
But then also, we, for 3 years in 2008, 2009, and 2011, my sister and I published a calendar called Fairy Tale Moons. And it took traditional fairy tales and used them to name the moon each month. So at least in North America, the Native Americans named the full moons each month. And
do that here too.
To inform the culture about what's happening. Like it might be the green corn moon, or the long night moon, or the frost moon, the wolf moon, strawberry moon, and all of these things really informed the community. You didn't have calendars hanging on the wall to say, oh, there's going to be a super moon tomorrow night, but it's that counting the moons. And so I had this idea, I could name the full moon according to fairy tales. And then you would always have a story to tell under the stars each month. And so that for a long time has been waiting to be turned into a book. So we have 3 years for each month. So ideally three stories and artwork. And so we're already at work on that.
Cool.
Yeah.
That'd be a great resource. Are they stories you made up, or are they?
No, they're traditional tales. In fact, 1 year we did the story of, I hope that I'm pronouncing it right, Tane.
Oh yeah, Tane Mahuta?
Yeah.
Or just Tane? Yeah. Interesting. Cool. What month?
November.
All right. Which story was it about him? About him pushing his parents apart, or?
Yes, that story.
Yeah, yes. Right. Cool.
And so it was challenging for me, because when we started to do it, I didn't have as much exposure to fairy tales coming from other cultures or mythologies. It wasn't by design. It was just, that's what I had been exposed to. So I started.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. So trying to find the ways that what we see in the night sky might show up in a tale. And are you familiar with the story Jack and the Beanstalk? Yeah. So I know that you see the constellation Orion in the southern hemisphere. Yeah. So in the month of March, Orion is visible in both the northern and the southern hemispheres. And so I called March the handful of beans moon, in relationship to the story of Jack and the Beanstalk, because you can imagine that the milking cow that he takes to market to sell because he and his mother are so poor, that's Taurus.
Yeah.
A handful of beans that he trades the cow for, that's Pleiades. And the three gifts that he steals from the giant is Orion, and the three gifts are the three stars at his belt, which is the hen that lays the golden eggs, the 3 bags of gold, and the singing harp. So you can just see, it's a way to say, there's this is a story in the sky. I can tell this story in the month of March and know that it's connecting to the night sky overhead.
That's so cool.
Yeah. So just using an imagination to plant seeds and to really support the importance of telling fairy tales, because they do belong to something that is nourishing for the human being.
For sure. So have you got that in printing yet, or is it still a couple of years away? Months?
Yeah, I'd like to say months, but right now we're also doing a subscription. It won't start until the fall for us, so September, where you can subscribe to get a calendar each month of 1 page with the map on one side and then the story on the other side. So that's really the first project we're doing.
Oh, that's a good idea.
So it's kind of like the maps that are in the book, and you'll get guidance for how to find your way around the sky, and then the story that you can tell.
Right.
And then that is connected both to the Star Tales of Mother Goose and to Fairy Tale Moons, because we've got all these years of research and work and stories that can go into that calendar and then go into this next book that we'll do. So
Nice.
yeah.
Cool. So where can people buy your book again? Could you say that again? And we
can buy it at starlore.co, starlore.co. And that's our website. And you can, if you're buying internationally, we do have that calculates the international shipping price. And so I think that's the easiest way. I mean, here in Michigan, where I am, my local bookstores are selling it.
Cool.
But so you could, contact one of my local bookstores if you wanted to also, and they would pack it up and ship it off.
Have you contacted like Bella Luna Toys or any of those other books?
Not yet, because we've just, to get it finished, get it up to print and get it in our hands has been quite an experience and quite a process. We haven't even really officially released it yet. But we did a pre-sale, and then we got the books just a few days ago, and we're still putting together the information for the publishing house. So we self-published with a group called Mission Point Press.
Yeah, right.
And they push it out to all of their sources. So we're still in those stages.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
And when you self-publish, you buy a certain number of books, right? And so we're trying to look at what point might we have to reorder.
Yeah.
So I think that some of like what you've said, Bella Luna, like this might be like the second, not the second
wave.
Yeah, the second wave, like first to meet everybody that pre-ordered and everything that belongs to this first step.
Yeah, I hear
then
you.
Look at now, what other potential places are there, and also really trusting that I don't want to sound naive, but just that it will find its way to the right places.
Yeah, I think it will.
Yeah, and I think, and that's in part choosing to not be on Amazon, because it's just wanting to really make sure it gets to where it wants to be, and it doesn't just become excess.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to gauge that. How many books do we print, and how do we distribute them? Yeah,
it's a whole thing.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. And I guess to go back to that question about self-publishing, another part of that is having, for us at least, and for me, was having an established audience in my subject matter, so that then it was easy to say to that audience, now there's a book. Because when you're self-publishing, I think a lot of the work is in promoting the book.
Yeah, for sure.
And so you have to really have this kind of relationship to social media and know how to, get people excited about what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure.
Take action. Yeah, because I think in this day and age, that's a lot of what moves things. Yeah,
totally. Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of wraps us up for the day. Is there anything else that you wanted to add before we say?
I always want to express my gratitude. I really appreciate your interest in this work and what I'm doing, and thank you for that. Yeah,
you're welcome. Thank you for being one of my most regular guests. It's great. It's easy talking to you because you're so good at talking, so I can just kind of sit back and listen to some nice stories. It's great. Well, I hope that your book makes you millions of dollars in an ethical way.
Enough to keep us going so we can do it again.
Yeah, totally. And people should follow you on social media. I've noticed that you've got two pages now, which
I do, right. So I have Star Mares on Instagram, which is my personal site, and then Starlore. Starlore Historian.
Yeah.
Which is actually a hashtag that I created for myself, and I thought, well, we'll just call the other page, we'll call it that.
Yeah, right. Well, I'll put all those. Oh, sorry. Continue.
Yeah, no, go. And then I have a Facebook account, Storytellers Night Sky, and that's the name of my it's kind of like a blog site, the Storytellers Night Sky.
Mm.
And then we created starlord.co specifically for this book.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to have too many different names out there, but it's all just
People
trying to get at this, storytelling with the stars.
Yeah. Yeah. And so if people follow you on those platforms, then they'll be informed about your fairy tale moon calendar thing as well.
Yes, about the calendar, about the book, about events that I have coming up. And also, gosh, now you reminded me, I'm creating a calendar on the website that if you subscribe to it, then it will populate your smart device with the Storytellers Night Sky approach to understanding the phenomena that are happening in the sky.
Oh, wow. Cool.
Yeah.
Great.
Because I have 10 years of radio archives and a lot of articles and a lot of resources that you can get to get really good story and poetry and ideas.
Mm.
So I'm in the process of putting that all together.
Nice. Nice.
Yeah.
It's of great value for people who are parents, teachers, and just artists, creative, general human beings will benefit from it all anyway.
Yeah, and to also kind of serve as a companion to this kind of calendar presentation that I see that like the New York Times does. So they have an astronomy calendar that you can subscribe to, and it's all of the, SpaceX is doing this or NASA is doing that. And it's really informative, and it's just the science.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I want to give voice to the poets and the artists and the humanities.
Nice. We need them both.
Yes,
well,
we do.
I'll let you get on with your evening because we've been talking for an hour and a half and it's been lovely.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Thank you.
Yeah.
It's always a pleasure. And it's making its way to you starting Monday. So
I'm excited. I'll talk to you about paying for the shipping when we've
okay.
and all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Cool.
Thank you
all
so
right.
much.
Bye, Mary.
Bye. Happy stargazing.
Yeah.